Why hello! Is it time for tea? I'm holding it up so it's like less awkward to read me, but read me. I said what I said. Hi guys, it's Leanne and welcome back to what is possibly the most anticipated video that I do every year. You guys are a little bit mad for me dishing dirt. That's what we get brought up on here in Scotland. Iron brew, haggis and brutal honesty. It's time for my worst books of 2021, or my most disappointing books of 2021, or the books that gave me a headache and dented my walls in 2021. You know, because like I threw them at the wall. And why, you may ask, do I put such emphasis on saying these are my worst books of 2021? I shall tell you, tender viewer. Like everything else in the world, from ice cream flavours, Marvel ships, and whether you are buying into the 90s fashion revival thing, these are but opinions which I own, and they may be different from everybody else's opinions on the internet. They may, in fact, be very different from your other favourite booktuber's opinion on this book. But I have, if nothing else, been very clear that opinions live on this channel. I shall defend your right to have yours, even if it's different from mine. So remember, if any of these were your favourite books of the year, I'm not bashing you. I'm not bashing the authors. I'm sometimes bashing the publishers. But all in all, you are allowed to like what you like, and this video will not take that away from you. That said, if you do think I'm wrong, you can tell me about that in the comments. I like the chat. And as usual, none of my worst books are in any particular order. So the first one that we're going to talk about, it hurts me. This is She Was the Storm by Sherry Averitt. It is a very short poetry collection. And this was sent to me last year as a gift, which made me feel doubly guilty when I discovered the content. So I think it's fair to say I've read in a lot of different genres of poetry over my life, and one of them that I particularly enjoy is the section of poetry that has become like popularist poetry. Instagram poetry, if you will. We won't get into what white elitist cisgendered man came up with that term. We'll just, you know, roll on by. And that, I am sure, is exactly what Sherry Averitt thought that they were producing when they released this book. But what this book actually is, and I'm very sad that I no longer have it in my possession to show you. I will, if I can, find some screenshots and put them up here as I'm talking about this. I actually kind of feel like calling it a collection of poetry is a misrepresentation of what this actually is, which is more like, at best, 6-line snapshots of platitudes. One of the poems is, I am tired of giving my everything to someone who doesn't notice my efforts. Which is a great sentiment, and I love the energy that you're putting out into the world. But without trying to define what poetry is as a genre, this doesn't strike me as very poetic. And again, I'm not talking about turning this into some 1830s poetry here. I'm literally just talking about putting any kind of genuine individualised spin on the words that are contained in these pages. I never felt like I got a sense of who the author was as a poet. There didn't seem to be any one particular style that they were going for. And what really annoyed me about it, because fine, it was mediocre poetry, big deal, was that about halfway through this collection, which claims on Kindle to be 81 pages, but that seems like a stretch for what I read, it goes from 6-line poetry, which does attempt to give some sort of nod at poetic form on the page, to literally one-liners. Pages and pages of one-liners that are less than 10 words long. And there are so many of them, one after another, and they meant nothing. One of the reviews that I read when I added this to Goodreads called it patronising, and I had one of those light bulb moments where I was like, that is what it is. So in conclusion, sigh of day. So that brings us to not more poetry, but instead to a book written in verse. This is Here is the Beehive by Sarah Crossan, and this came into my life because I had just, not long before it was published, read Moonrise, I think, by Sarah Crossan, which is a YA book written in verse. It took the idea of victimhood and really deconstructed it, and I absolutely loved it. I was obsessed. And so I immediately, of course, went on to find her other novels and discovered that she was publishing this one. I also really loved the concept of this novel because it's about a woman who finds out that the man that she loves has died in a horrific accident, but she is actually his mistress. There is only one other person in his entire life who knows about this affair, and she then has nowhere to go with it and nobody to grieve with. I don't know, guys. I understand that there is a genre of especially literary fiction which exists solely to make you depressed. And I mean that quite literally. It exists only to tell you the most soul-destroying, desperate, heartbreaking stories and then leave you broken on the floor and give you no resolution at the end of it. I have sometimes participated in that genre. There are occasionally books which slip through the net. And so I kind of feel like half of the problem is me with this one because I'm over it. I'm over books that are just unrelentingly bleak, where there's no let up, there's no breath of fresh air, there's no like extra side order of humour or sarcasm. So partially it could just be me. I'm willing to admit it could just be me. But the thing that most truly bleak narratives have is at least some characters that you root for. Characters that you would like go to bat for in their despair. And there's not a single one of them in this novel anywhere. The main character is going through genuine hell, absolute genuine hell, and I felt not one twinge of sympathy or real emotion during any of it. And I'm somebody who's usually quite affected by characters' anxiety in novels. It usually makes me feel that anxiety, but I didn't care. It was almost preternaturally strange how much I didn't care. And also, I just want to preemptively point out that this is not a judgment on the fact that they were having an affair. I picked up this book because they were having an affair. We love who we love, and sometimes we love people at complicated times that's not perfect for everybody else's lives. Not that I'm saying that affairs are all okay and we all go out and have them. I don't know how I'm in this hole, but you know what I mean. It's not a moral judgment. It's just a crap book. Oh, do we have to talk about this one? I'm so scarred by the fact that I had to read this book. Early last year, I did a little experimental bookshelf challenge with Emma from Drinking by My Shelf. We scavenger hunted 3 books together. One that we both owned, and then one from Emma's to-be-read pile, which I also had to read, and one from my to-be-read pile, which Emma also had to read. The one that came from my TBR pile was The Furies by Katie Lowe. And this book is a book that I think some people might say is just all vibes. But for me, it's less that it's just all vibes and more that it has all of the trappings of dark academia. But that's kind of the problem. It has all of the trappings of dark academia. Because you see, I feel like there are 2 types of dark academia novels. There's the one type which takes all of the tropes of dark academia and acknowledges how dark they are and how obsessive and compulsive they are. It acknowledges how destructive an environment it can be, and it acknowledges that secret societies are insidious and inescapable and wrong. It takes the fact that these institutions are teaching solely like white canon imperialist conqueror narratives, and it like flips that on its head, or like it critiques it in some way. And then there's the other kind of dark academia, which features sad, wasting, insipid white girls glamorizing that sallow-skinned twitching that you have when you've only lived on coffee and all-nighters. The kind that features secret societies which are kind of just like a high school girl gang, but now you've given them like power and knives. So they were still sadistic bitches, but now they're sadistic deadly bitches. And in case you hadn't guessed, The Furies was the latter kind of dark academia novel. It was so boring. It was so boring. Even the parts in this one that did actually mix in witchcraft with the boring white men history and classics, even those parts were just like, okay, that's fine. And Part of the dark academia thing is obviously that the writing is generally more florid. There are long melancholy descriptions, there are feverish ramblings, there's ode to the old brickwork, you know, all of that kind of stuff that I generally really like. But Katie Lowe, she took that and she went to Purple Town. Every description was like so long and overwrought. It was stuffed full of things that she was telling you that you should feel in response to the characters, but that you never actually got. It was another one of those books where the author tells you what the character is like and how everybody else responds to that character, and you're sitting there going, really? I didn't get any of that. Why do they like her? And I think if I were trying to condense down all of the problems that I have with this book, I would say it's the prologue promised so much and the book just delivered cruelty. The characters were cruel to each other, they hated the outside world, they also hated the inside world, and the occult stuff was just mediocre at best. I feel like I've watched really bad 80s witchcraft movies which did it in a more convincing way. So it's a no from me. Yeah. Next up we've got Codename Villanelle by Luke Jennings. I picked this up as part of a vlog project where I was reading the way that I did when I was a little kid on holiday, which was to like take a whole series of books and just chomp, 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 chomp. I picked this up because I absolutely loved Killing Eve, which is of course based on this Villanelle trilogy. It's full of really sharp, like razor sharp dialogue. It has murder and sapphic overtone. I could write entire psalms on the relationship between Villanelle and Eve and how it plays on really classic horror tropes, especially like the relationship between Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter. I have a lot of thoughts on this show, and so I thought picking up these relatively very small novels would also pack that kind of punch. But instead, all I thought about this book was, well, that was written by a man. I had a comment not that long ago in a video where I'd said I actually don't have that many male authors on my shelves anymore, and the person who commented on this video was clearly a cisgendered man, and he went, well, that is very elitist of you. How wrong of you to promote literature only written by women. Called me out essentially on gatekeeping literature for women, and I don't even know where to start with that comment. But I'm gonna guess that the person who left it would have really liked this book, because ooh, the male gaze is strong in this one, my friends. But the thing that really made my butt cheeks clench is that in the show, Eve, who is the detective following Villanelle, this assassin around the world, she is so determined, she's so driven that she's gonna find Villanelle that she is literally willing to give up almost anything to do it. She's hardworking and determined and she's really good at her job, but she discovers throughout the course of the first series that she's actually really undervalued by everybody around her, by her current bosses, she's massively undervalued, and by her husband, who just wants her to stay in her little box that she was in when they got married. He wants her not to develop and not move on. Part of the reason that she eventually ends up so drawn to Villanelle, because Villanelle spends all this time being like, be exactly who you want to be. I'm 30 different people a day and I love it. And that does not feature in this book whatsoever. Constantly, the entire time, Eve is whiny, she's worried, she's terrified what her husband is going to say about stuff. Her husband at several points really shames her, and she takes that on board and she's like, yes, it's definitely me. But the narrative is written in a way where you're not then looking at what her husband says and going, oh, that's a bit dodgy. It's like, no, isn't her husband right? Isn't she actually a bad person? And that is why she's morally grey. Not because she actually empathises with a serial killer is she morally grey, but because she doesn't want what her husband wants. And the entire rest of the narrative is framed that way. I could give you countless examples, it's pointless. Instead, I will simply say, if you love Killing Eve, just don't read the source material. Because apart from anything else, Luke Jennings is a journalist, and he writes like a journalist. He writes this book as if the entire thing was meant to be for a short front page that would be highly edited by somebody else. But the whole thing, it was sent in an email, it was meant to be published that night and never thought of again. I have so much respect for the people that adapted the script for the show. We'll leave it with that. Yeah. Now we come to a book that I think is best described as least said, soonest mended. This is The Escape Room by Megan Goldin. It was billed as a thriller in which 4 people from the same company were put into a lift, an elevator, if you will, together. And as they are going up the floors, the elevator stops and they discover that they're actually in an escape room and that they have to use the clues to get out of the escape room or they're all going to die. It sounded like such a cross-section of all of my interests. Harry and I are obsessed with escape room games. We are masters of them. And I love me a good thriller where people are going through stuff but have absolutely no idea who is doing it and have to do like the back work to try and figure out who's tormenting them. I love that. And so that is what I thought I was getting. This was not what I got. I'm weirdly stuck for words on where to start with this because there were so many things. For a start, the synopsis for this one actually tells you that the 4 people who are stuck in the elevator are people who have done really awful things. And they've done awful things like in a business setting. It tells you that they have struck $1 million deals and that they live a life of outrageous luxury. So I was expecting these characters to get knocked down a peg or two during this escape room situation. But I was also expecting to want them to come out of the end of it because they had like learned things about themselves and they had changed. I just wanted them to die. I just wanted them to continually get clues wrong and be killed off one at a time, and preferably the bloodiest and most excruciating fashion that the person who had set this trap could find. Because all that we got constantly, every other chapter, about how they closed deals, like so much detail about how they closed these deals, so much detail that we didn't need. Juxtaposed with nothing, because then we also got a mind-numbing level of detail about their amazing lifestyles and all of the parties that they could afford to throw and all of the things they could buy. And I didn't get it. I didn't know what the purpose was, because we know from the very first page that things end really badly, and in order to make these deals they hurt a lot of people. We know all of that from the first page. But I don't know what all of the other pages were for. There's no real reveal. There's no real twist. We know right from the beginning why they're in there, who put them in there, and what's going to happen. And okay. It's a great concept. Full marks for that. Another one that we can tick off the list fairly quickly is Here the Whole Time by Victor Martins. My issue with this was several-fold, but I'll focus on 2 specific things. This is a YA, but it feels more middle grade queer book in which a fat male main character believes that he will never find any kind of romantic relationship anywhere because he is so fat and unattractive. And before I go on to discuss the contents of the book, I want to talk quickly about the cover, which is not the author's fault. The author has nothing to do with the cover of their books. We've had this discussion a lot on BookTube. We know this by now. But in 2021, there were a lot of books that came out featuring fat protagonists. And I loved it. Fat Rep is finally trickling into the mainstream publishing world and it's great. And there are a lot of really, really good covers showing plus size characters. Granted, they are almost all illustrated. The ones that have like photographs of random people on the cover are almost never fat, but that's a modelling thing that we will tackle at another time. I'm just glad that fat bodies, like mine, are being represented on the front covers of books. And to that end, this was not it. So this cover that I'm showing you right now is the cover that I had when I read it. And the bottom character, in case you're confused, is the one who is supposed to be fat. And I guess that we are finding that out from like the extra line that they have drawn on his cheek. I don't know. This is not a fat character to me. I see nothing in this to say this is a fat character. Here is the other most seen cover of this novel, and once again, crickets! Neither of these boys are fat. Neither of them are fat. I'm assuming the character with his eye open is meant to be the one who is fat, and the only indication that I have of that is that he has a slightly different nose from the other character. And we're not even going to discuss this one, which just has an extra line added to otherwise masculine legs in a swimming pool. I don't know. I don't know what any of the publishers were thinking about doing with any of these covers. They are horrific. In fact, they are a perfect indication of how we do not represent fat bodies on covers. But I was generally hopeful that the narrative would be, again, nothing like the covers, which the authors don't have any control over, and no, not so much. Before I go any further discussing the fat rep in this book, I want to just talk about the actual writing style itself. I was completely unconvinced from the first page that this was a teenage boy. It absolutely always sounded like an adult writing a teenager and writing how they think that a teenager speaks and the way that they think that a teenager acts. And I think what the author was trying to show was that the main character was a very flamboyant person, and instead all we got was like shoehorned Drag Race reference and some just really awful stuff that felt very like the person who wrote this had their childhood in the 90s. All of the main characters' references to femininity and the way in which they wanted to be feminine came from really 90s things, like going and getting a magazine that has all the tips to be the best, cutest girl on it, that has like a friendship bracelet that you can share with your friend. The things that they watched on TV, the stuff that they did, it felt very clunky. And I think that didn't help, because then I was annoyed at the publishers and at the author, and we hadn't even got to the relationship or the fat rep yet. All I'm going to say about the relationship is this type of insta-love is boring. It is a main character who is otherwise not mainstream falling in love with a guy who is mainstream just because he's mainstream and not because of him or anything that he is interested in or does or says. And you know, there is an argument to be made here that I am reading this book in an adult's eyes that was not generally intended for my audience but was intended for a younger audience. But in that case, I think that the author is writing down to the audience. And then of course there's the fat representation, which it was mentioned a lot, but it didn't go anywhere. The most really confronting thing that the narrator had was not being able to get cute clothes that he liked because the clothes didn't go up to his size. And yeah, that's definitely a thing that a lot of fat people, including myself, go through. It promotes fast fashion. If you want to buy something sustainable in a bigger size, you have to literally pay an entire limb for it, whereas there are fast fashion companies that are offering really cute stuff for really cheap, and so fat people are backed into an ethical or moral debate. None of that was unpicked in here. None of it. It was just that tiny reference. Couldn't find cute clothes. Very sad. Let's move on. And again, I understand that this is a book for younger readers, but that is the place to put these things. When we talk about fat representation, we have to talk about how completely endemic it is in our society, and it was bad. It was just bad. There are many other books that do this thing better, and a lot of them are independently published, so go read those instead. And then finally, I saved the arguable best for last. The book that gave me the most emotions in one book that were all negative. All of them in the one place. All of the icks, all of the why does it exist. And that wonderful trophy goes to The Apartment by S.L. Gray. A moment of silence for the brain cells that I lost while experiencing this book. Okay, we'll start with the publishing problem that this book has, which is that it is billed as a thriller and it is not. It's a horror novel. I've talked about this before, but there has been a thing in publishing over the last 2 years-ish where we are being sold thriller novels as thrillers with thriller covers that match the other kinds of things in the genres, and then when you read them, they are not. They are straight up horror. And when I say straight up horror, I'm not being like, oh my god, the body count's too high for it to be a thriller, there's too much gore for it to be a thriller. I'm talking about straight up supernatural elements, ghosts, horrible little demony things. And I'm not just talking about books like The Apartment, which is one of those books that you might have heard of, you might have not. I'm talking about much, much bigger releases, much more hyped releases, like The Chalkman, which is stuff that you absolutely will have heard of if you like things in the thriller genre. And it's a problem, because it's another one of those situations where publishers have decided that, oh, if I can just get this book into the hands of people who like thrillers, I know that they'll like it. It has so many of the same elements, I know that they'll like it. It's like they have looked only at the price tags of these genres and realised that thrillers sell very quickly in mass quantities, and that if you want that kind of thing in the horror genre, you have to be a well-established author with many, many books. And of course, I am not saying that there aren't books out there which are difficult to market and to pin down in one genre because they have so many different things going on in them, and that those books aren't amazing. They are, but these books are not that. They are just straight up supernatural horror, and that's where they should exist. So that's what The Apartment is. It's about ghosts, and demony ghosts at that. It's not a thriller, so don't go into it. If you're looking for like a creepy, why has somebody rented them this apartment thing, that's not what you're going to get. At the start of this book, we meet a couple who have had their house broken into, they've had things stolen, their family was terrorised, and they don't feel safe in their home. Their solution to this is to rent an apartment which they can't afford. They blatantly cannot afford this trip. They're both worried about money the entire time, but they decide that they're going to go anyway. And they were so terrorised and brutalised during this attack that they leave their daughter, their very young daughter, with her grandmother and go away without her to try and overcome all of the effects of what has happened to them. They get to this apartment. It's in an abandoned building. The rest of the building is seemingly empty. There are no lights on in windows, there are no other people on the stairs. It smells like it's been shut up for a long time. They have problems getting in the doors. And when they get into this apartment, they discover that the walls are literally dripping with condensation. The sheets are damp because it's so cold and mildewy. And to their dubious credit, they do try to email this person and they can't get in touch with them. And none of this raises any red flags. None of it. They just like plod blithely on, which is when it becomes a kind of domestic thrillery situation. Again, another one of those freaking books where it's just like, if you two weren't together, none of this would need to exist. There is no other purpose to this novel other than to show how completely and utterly miserable you two are making each other. And throughout all of this, the guy then starts to see a ghost, and it's just revealed. If you're planning to read this book, don't listen on to any more of this because it is definitely a spoiler. It is revealed randomly that his teenage daughter had died. He is absolutely convinced that it's his teenage daughter, which fine, would be fine, mediocre, but fine. Except that as the book goes on, he starts to have sexy times with this ghost. It whispers in his ear seductively. At one point, it bites his cheek and leaves teeth marks, and he enjoys it because he's being close to her. It is the creepiest, weirdest thing ever. They're like, oh my god, I can't get my expensive flights to Paris changed to another day, so we're just gonna have to stay in the mouldy hair apartment. They don't contact the police, they don't leave, they don't go sit in the train station or anywhere else. They just kind of sit there and wait for the horrific things to happen, and they do. So many pages of freaking boring, horrific things happen. And I think, genuinely, this couldn't have been published in the horror genre because horror readers would have seen the entire plot coming. So the publisher was like, we'll have to give it to thriller people because maybe they won't have read this before. You know how sometimes you sit with a book afterwards and you're like, how did you get through the editing process? How did you slip the net, get to an editor and get published without anybody sitting down and going, maybe we need to revise this part? But massive shout out to my patrons who I read this entire book with on a stream and who kept me laughing about it the entire time when otherwise I might have literally just torn it up. So there we go guys, there we have it. There was my worst books or my most disappointing books of the year, my slightly bitchy reviews of the books that were quite trash in 2021 for me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that this was everything that you were looking forward to for the entire year. And as I said at the start, as always, if any of these are your favourite books, if you enjoyed any of these books and you want to tell me how terrifically wrong I am, please leave it below in the comments, because opinions live here. And lastly, of course, if you would like to recommend me any antidotes to these books, you know, books that do similar things better, I would love that. And I will speak to all of you super soon. Bye! I wonder how many times I'm gonna have to cut out super swears from this video. You know, like not regular swears, but super swears. Maybe I should give you a tally in a pinned comment, or maybe I should not.